One of my experiences growing up that I kind of wonder if people coming up behind me will experience now was in high school, we all read To Kill a Mockingbird. And we all had kind of this happy glow about how wonderful Atticus was. And even with the bittersweet ending, it still seemed as though we were wiser, and we had become wiser through an experience that was emotionally stressful, reading that story, but also in some way we kept being drawn back to it. It really was a remarkable novel, and I'm not that surprised that Harper Lee didn't want to publish anything afterward, because how do you follow that? Well, a couple of years ago, it was all over the news that her next novel was going to be published, her long-awaited follow-up to Kill a Mockingbird, and it even included the same characters, and it was called Go Set a Watchman. And then people read it, and people got very, very upset, because Atticus gave a speech in this new novel where it became clear that he had become a white supremacist. And there are a couple of reactions that I had to that at the time. The first one is very, very obviously Harper Lee was writing a story that happened in a different universe. Now, how do you know this? Because if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, and then you read Go Set a Watchman, in Go Set a Watchman, Atticus refers to the fact that he got Tom Robinson acquitted of the rape charge, which means we knew this already. This was already in with the coverage of this novel coming out, that Harper Lee had written this novel a very long time ago. If I'm not mistaken, she actually wrote it before she wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. It was one of her early attempts at writing a novel. And so, if you still love To Kill a Mockingbird, go ahead and love it. And if you still love the character of Atticus Finch, go ahead and love him. He was fictional in the first place, and this story where he became a white supremacist, she wrote that beforehand, and she wrote it in another universe with different events. That story did not fill out the world and add in details about Atticus Finch, because that story is completely incompatible with the reality in which To Kill a Mockingbird happened. The second thing that's true, though, I actually didn't find it that upsetting. I grew up in the southern part of the United States, and I have known many people who, as they got older, and as the prefrontal cortex lost some of its vitality and they became less able to suppress their impulses, they became quicker to speak from their emotions and from their drives, and a little bit less careful to think things through before speaking. I mean, there's a reason that so many people have jokes about their racist grandma. And I did have a racist grandma, by the way. My racist grandma was on my mother's side of the family. And when I told her what college I had chosen, she wanted to know what city it was in. And I told her, and she said, "Are there any N-words there?" And she hadn't been throwing that language around when she was younger, when I was younger. But now she was getting near the end of her life. She only lived about another 5 years after that conversation, I think, and so things like that just popped out of her mouth. So if Atticus Finch got into the last years of his life and some combination of his fear and his lessened ability to suppress his impulses led him to talk that way, I just think that makes the character more believable. I think it makes him a little bit less of the hero in a cartoonish story, and he becomes a little bit more complicated. Now, I'm rattling on and on because I'm warming up to the subject of To Kill a Mockingbird, because that's what I got to thinking about near the end of last week. But I wasn't thinking about Atticus Finch. I was thinking about Bob Ewell. Because in some sense, To Kill a Mockingbird was this anthem to empathy. Empathy is so wonderful. Tom Robinson is in some sense the updated version of Jim from Huckleberry Finn. He is the Negro who is put, and I use that because that would have been the term at the time it was published, who's put in an impossible situation, and a lot of people who are accustomed to feeling no sympathy, only feeling alienation, they think of Tom Robinson being locked up and then put to death the same way you might think of a cold germ being killed by the medication you take, although I guess there's no medicine for cold germs, by the bacteria being killed by the antibiotic. You don't feel any sympathy for the disease germ that's in you. It's extinguished. It's a problem. You're better off with it extinguished, and there are too many people who were from the Deep South through many chapters of the history of the United States who thought that when things like that happened to African Americans, Republicans, it was, it made life in the community better. It was progress. And so, hearing the story of Tom Robinson laid out in a way that he was a sympathetic character and that very obviously his defender, Atticus Finch, was the hero, that was one of the ways that the novel made a case for empathy. But what was interesting, and the tension that I think drew people back to the novel, was that Atticus, when Tom Robinson was convicted anyway, and I hope I didn't just spoil it. If you haven't read the book, you should have read it years ago. But Atticus, even after Tom Robinson was convicted, Atticus didn't pack his bags and move out of town. He knew that the people on that jury were the people that he lived with. And he knew that keeping the jury out that long, and that at least one member of that jury had walked into the deliberations demanding that Tom Robinson be acquitted, Atticus knew that that was progress. He did not hate Tom Robinson for being of a different racial group, but he also didn't hate his neighbors for being racists. He didn't hate anybody. But for me, well, okay, I was about to claim a level of nobility that I really am not entitled to. The character that I now think of in the story that was completely problematic is Bob Ewell, because Bob Ewell is the one that we're supposed to hate. Bob Ewell is the incorrigible bad guy. In the first place, he's white, so he doesn't have an excuse for his behavior. He ought to be on top of the world, because this is a community where the whites are at the top of the social stratum and the African Americans are at the bottom. But he's poor white trash, and it's okay to look down on white trash. He's white trash because he's poor and because he's an alcoholic. And I think when the book was published, to be poor meant you weren't working hard enough. We did not want to pay attention to some of the intergenerational structural forces that perpetuate poverty. And alcoholism, I've talked about this before, back then it was just a moral failing. Being an alcoholic was on a level with just being a rude jerk. It just meant that there was something about your character, your moral fiber, that was weak and it was within your control. And so, hating Bob Ewell was okay, because we're better than Bob Ewell. But what I've been thinking about lately, and it makes me see that entire novel differently in a way Go Set a Watchman never could, Bob Ewell was not worse than the people around him. The other people in this community didn't want to see him. Once a year at Christmas, they would give the Ewell family charity, and then they wanted him gone. Bob Ewell abused his children, but you look at the corner that he was backed into. That city, that small town, had made up its mind about the Ewell family. The novel makes that abundantly clear, because that community had made up its mind about every family and had attached to them a judgment that was indelible and that was reinforced by selective observation of their behaviors generation after generation. Even if Bob Ewell gave birth to Stephen Hawking, even if the Ewell family produced a child that was a genius and of upright moral standing, you got to be naive to think that that town would have allowed that child to recognize even a sliver of their potential. Now, Bob Ewell contributed to his situation with his own cruelty and his own wickedness. But I started this all the way back in January by saying the one thing that I think is fundamental is that it's not okay to hate. I think Harper Lee probably wrote Bob Ewell into the novel for a couple of reasons. First of all, because in her part of the world, she may have seen a couple of people who had most of the characteristics of Bob Ewell, so the character was believable. Secondly, because the novel had a more powerful driver if there was a stark black and white, that was not meant to be a pun, if there was a stark, sharp conflict inside it. The more fuzzy the conflict is, the harder it can be to drive the narrative ahead, because you leave the reader doing the difficult work of deciding how to judge every scene instead of having some scenes where there's clarity. So what I do today in 2017 is I look at Trump voters and I say, it's okay for me to get that angry and that disdainful and to separate myself, categorize myself separately from them because I'm better, because my thinking is better, my judgment is better, because I look at Donald Trump and his tweets and his vendettas and his claims that the Access Hollywood video are faked. I look at all of that and I say, that's irrational, and anyone who finds that appealing, who thinks that that is quality leadership, their thinking is just somehow categorically worse than mine. Now, on that subject, I think I'm probably correct and they're probably mistaken. I think I probably have better reasons, and I'm comfortable even now continuing to say that. But what I keep stumbling back into is saying I have good reasons and they have no reason. And if I do that, I am reducing Trump voters to Bob Ewell. And there are some parallels between a lot of the people that Trump spoke to and the Bob Ewells of the world. There are a lot of people that it's real easy to vilify, but they have been backed into a corner by their circumstances. I don't like what Donald Trump said about the white supremacist and neo-Nazi rallies on the East Coast. But when he said there were good people on all sides, he failed in his leadership, but that statement is not 100% wrong. A lot of people who have made that choice are the Bob Ewells of the world, and it can feel very, very satisfying. It can feel very emotionally functional to just come down as hard as I can, condemning them, writing them off, and hoping that when this story gets written, they wind up stabbed in the dark and nobody mourning them. That's what happened to Bob Ewell at the end of the book. But when I work myself up into a rage at the foolishness that I see, I am doing the same thing. The people who turned a blind eye to Bob Ewell, who showed up with their charity baskets near Christmas and then treated him and his children, who did not choose that life, neither did he when he was a child, when they treat all of them as invisible, they are the same people who ultimately convict Tom Robinson. And back when I was 15 and first read the novel, if you asked which of those was the more wicked, convicting Tom Robinson or making Bob Ewell and his entire family invisible, back then it would have been an easy call. I would have said that Bob Ewell earned it and that Tom Robinson was innocent. I still think, given the construction of the story, that Tom Robinson was innocent. But the idea that Bob Ewell earned it, that is the mistaken move that I keep making. That is how I keep contributing to the hollowing out of the connective tissue of our communities. If there are Bob Ewells around me, they shouldn't be invisible, and they shouldn't be written off the way he was written off by his neighbors. And just the other day I spotted my copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and I haven't picked it up and read it, and there are actually half a dozen details in the book that probably would either build up the case I'm making or possibly challenge it in some productive ways. That's something I think I'm going to do when classes wrap up in a couple of weeks and Christmas begins. I'm going to read To Kill a Mockingbird front to back, but I'm going to give it a very revisionist reading. And maybe what it can motivate me to do is to look around at the people I share this community with and give my own community a revisionist reading as well.